what if the man behind the Holocaust was living quietly in your neighborhood? By 1946, Hitler and his top lieutenants were gone, and the Reich lay in ruins. But its influence still reached across the world. Many of the worst Nazis had slipped into the shadows, some aided by powerful hands. Among them was a paper pusher who sent millions to their deaths. On today's episode of the Infographic Show, we're tracing the global hunt for the Holocaust architect. In May 1960, a team of Mossad Nazi hunters ran a covert operation in Buenos Aires. Every evening at 7:40, a man stepped off a bus beside a kiosk. Sometimes he bought cigarettes, lit one, and moved on. If a car approached in the dark, he clicked on a small flashlight. Before entering his house, he always circled the perimeter as if checking for danger. The team split into two units, one waiting in a black Chevrolet, the other beside a black Buick, staged as a broken-down car. A fake chauffeur leaned under the hood while two men pretended to help. In one agent's pocket were photos of his murdered family, victims of the very man they hoped to catch that night. The man never got off the bus. They had waited 15 years for this moment. For 3 weeks, they had surveilled his daily routine. But on this day, the bus raced right past them, leaving their agents with a sinking feeling their target had been tipped off. Years earlier, as the Reich collapsed, the man Adolf Eichmann had met in secret with Gestapo chief Heinrich Müller. SS officers were already plotting their escapes from Germany. Across Europe, Allied forces were liberating the death camps, their horrors exposed. Eichmann surveyed the desperate officers forging papers, some of them planning to pose as innocent salesmen. He wanted none of it. It was embarrassing. Gesturing to his Steyr pistol, he told Müller if the worst came, a gun was all he needed. If that didn't work, there was always cyanide. Before leaving that day, he reminded them, "I will gladly and happily jump into the pit with the knowledge that with me are 5 million enemies of the Reich." He meant the Jews that he had played a major part in exterminating. He fled Berlin under fire as Russian tanks rolled in, as Red Army soldiers, vengeance in their eyes, took to the city. For Eichmann, it was a disgrace. The 1,000-year Reich was over, but he wasn't going to die like a trapped animal. He made a perilous journey to Alto See in the Austrian Alps, where he and several SS officers drank cognac and played solitaire while planning their next move. Then the news came. Hitler was dead. Eichmann gathered about 200 men, the Hitler Youth and wounded SS, and with money, gold, and weapons, they marched to the mountains. The plan was to go down fighting, but an order arrived banning them from firing on Allied troops. What that meant was the war was truly over. The Germans had given up. Eichmann hurried back to Alto See, where his wife Vera was holed up in their chalet by the lake. He had never let her know the full extent of his work, although she knew enough to know he would be hanged if the Allies got him. "The war is over," he told her, his face downcast as he handed her a cyanide pill just in case the Russians came first. Outside, his sons played, unaware of the horrors their father inflicted on millions of innocent people. Eichmann told Vera to be brave. If he survived, he would find a way to make contact. With a small band of Nazis, he fled into the mountains once more, but soon one man found the courage to confront him. Eichmann was a hunted war criminal. Behind his back, the others had agreed they stood a better chance without him. The betrayal stung, but he understood, raising a final toast of schnapps before moving on with one companion toward Germany. They had no papers, little money, and no safe house to head to. Allied patrols prowled everywhere. The Russians were shipping men to camps without trial. The Americans and British had already seized many top Nazis. Eichmann's name wasn't yet marked as a major war criminal, but he knew it was only a matter of time until it was. When an American patrol stopped him, he gave them a false name, Adolf Barth, a Luftwaffe corporal. He and his companion were sent to a camp crammed with other Germans. That night, they escaped to Salzburg, on the border with Germany. On the run, Eichmann kept telling himself that he had only followed orders. Bound by the SS oath, "My honor is my loyalty," he'd merely done his duty. In his twisted mind, he wasn't a villain, he was not a murderer, just a soldier carrying out commands. But he was wrong. Eichmann joined the Nazi Party in 1932 and soon worked for the SS intelligence arm. His first task was rounding up Freemasons. His meticulousness earned him a post in the Jewish Affairs Office. Now regarded as an expert on Jews, he once wrote that they were, quote, "the most dangerous enemy of the Reich." Still, at that point, he believed mass emigration was the answer. In 1938, he arranged the relocation of 200,000 Jews from Austria, telling a friend, "They are in my hands. They dare not take one step without me." As Nazi conquests expanded, Eichmann's value rose. In 1939, he was tasked with running the Office for Jewish Emigration, organizing forced deportations. After Poland fell, he oversaw the uprooting of entire communities and proposed resettling up to 4 million Jews in Madagascar. The scheme collapsed. It was logistically impossible, especially with a war going on. On July 31, 1941, a month after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, Reinhard Heydrich received new orders. Heydrich was one of the highest-ranking Nazis and a principal architect of the Holocaust. Göring's directive was clear: prepare the general solution of the Jewish question and draft plans for what would become the final solution. Heydrich summoned Eichmann, telling him the Führer had ordered the physical extermination of the Jewish people. Eichmann later admitted he struggled to grasp the significance of Heydrich's words. Not long after, Eichmann, Heydrich, and the Gestapo chief Heinrich Müller met in a lakeside cottage outside of Berlin. They drank brandy by the fire and drew up systemic plans to deliver millions of Jews from across Europe to the camps. Eichmann was fully on board, once writing that the Jews were stealing the breath of life from us. But he was no frontline soldier. He was the architect of the deportation machine that fed around 6 million to their deaths. He didn't pull the trigger, but he had plenty of blood on his hands. In 1944, on a visit to Western Poland, he watched Jews stripped naked and forced into a mobile gas van. Shrieking, he later recalled, until the gas stopped their cries. At the burial ditch, he watched a civilian pry gold teeth from the corpses with pliers. Later, at Minsk, he saw Jews thrown alive into a pit and shot one by one. He would later claim that he found it horrible, that the killings were turning young Germans into sadists, and that he was not tough enough for such brutality. But he knew exactly how the machinery of death worked. He was the man who oiled the wheels. He became the mastermind of deportation across Europe. He dealt in quotas, graphs, and charts, cold, bureaucratic numbers, masking human catastrophe. He arranged for Jews to be forced into ghettos, stripped of possessions, businesses stolen, and assets seized. He helped organize the trains, people packed into cattle cars where many, including the young and old, suffocated or died of exhaustion before reaching the camps. To prevent uprisings, he devised deception campaigns, reassuring Jewish leaders, sometimes pocketing bribes, further fueling the Nazi machine. Occasionally, he addressed the victims himself, standing before long lines of the condemned. Jews, you have nothing to worry about. We want only the best for you. But a few years later, the hunter had become the hunted. Eichmann planned to get back to Germany from Salzburg, but he was captured on the way by Americans. His position within the Nazi Party was hard to hide. He had the SS tattoo of his blood type written on his arm, a directive from Himmler. He had tried to burn it off with a cigarette to no avail, and now it got him sent to another camp. This time he claimed to be Otto Eichmann of the 22nd Waffen-SS Cavalry Division. Shuffled from camp to camp, he eventually ended up near Nuremberg. Along the way, he saw ruins, emaciated POWs, and burned-out trucks. Symbols of defeat. He knew he had to get out. The Allies still didn't realize what a prize prisoner they had on their hands. Soon, though, the name Adolf Eichmann would be on everyone's lips, including those of Simon Wiesenthal, a camp survivor whose mother had been murdered and wife deported. Wiesenthal was compiling lists of war criminals for the American Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, and also the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the precursor to the CIA. He quickly grasped that Eichmann had played a central role in the extermination of Europe's Jews. What he didn't realize was that Jewish Nazi hunters and Western intelligence agencies both pursued high-ranking war criminals, but for very different reasons. Back in the camps where Otto Eichmann lined up with other SS men, survivors didn't recognize his face. Lucky for him, he'd always kept to the shadows. Interrogated again and again by the CIC, he knew they would get him eventually. At times, he considered cyanide, but he still partly believed that he could one day see his family again. At Nuremberg, the worst of the Nazi leadership stood trial, but again and again, one name surfaced: Adolf Eichmann. Witnesses described him giving orders to camp commanders, serving as the Gestapo's chief of Jewish affairs and the mastermind behind the deportations. Dieter Wislicenny, Eichmann's subordinate for many years, testified that Eichmann called the final solution, quote, the planned biological annihilation of the Jewish race. When Wislicenny had expressed shock, he said Eichmann snapped at him to not be so sentimental. Eichmann was now a top target. CIC officers questioned Vera, his wife, who had not taken her cyanide pill. The Russians hadn't got to her. She claimed that she knew nothing of his whereabouts and had no recent photographs. To the CIC, Eichmann was a major priority, described as at least partly responsible for the extermination of 6 million Jews. He was seen as a desperate type likely to shoot his way out, and a skilled alpinist, so possibly hiding in the mountains. What they didn't know was that Eichmann was already in their custody, listening to testimony about himself at the camp. Panicked, he confessed his identity to a Nazi officer and begged for help escaping. After another attempt to burn off his SS tattoo, he shaved his head, donned dyed clothes to look like a hunter, and slipped through the camp fence into the forest. By now, Eichmann was the most wanted Nazi of them all. No small feat when men like the Dr. Josef Mengele, the Angel of Death, and Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo torturer, were also at large. Barbie had actually been caught, first by the British and then by the Americans. The CIC had put him on the payroll. He was useful as an intelligence asset, a move that would one day result in an official apology. But Eichmann, they had no idea where he was. In 1946, 5 Nazi hunters staked out his chalet, where his wife and brother were living. One night they burst in during dinner. Several men were at the table. They struck one with a rifle butt and dragged him into the forest. The man swore he wasn't Eichmann, just a soldier who knew Eichmann's wife. Yes, he admitted he had killed Jews in the war, but only under orders. They didn't believe him. They shot him in the chest and buried him in the woods, thinking they had just killed a major war criminal. Eichmann was, in fact, in Germany, now living like a wild animal going by the name Otto Heininger. He managed to get into the British zone of the city with forged papers and got himself a job as a lumberjack. He blended right in, smoking Lucky Strikes at night with the men, playing violin for them as they drank endless glasses of schnapps. But he had to get out of Germany to have any chance of a stable life. His photograph was now being shared all over Europe. Worse for Eichmann, Rudolf Höss had testified about the gas chambers, saying Eichmann had visited the camps and discussed using Zyklon B. Word soon reached Eichmann. He had to get out of Germany fast. He'd heard a rumor that Jewish Avengers had killed him in a forest raid on his Austrian chalet, but he knew the Allies weren't fooled. They wouldn't stop hunting. Simon Wiesenthal certainly wouldn't. He had evidence Eichmann was still alive. Meanwhile, Vera tried to obtain an official death certificate so she could remarry or claim a widow's pension. If she succeeded, Wiesenthal feared the Allies might abandon the search. Eichmann's file was thick, but resources were thinning, and there were already plenty of high-ranking Nazis to deal with. Dozens were being held and interrogated at Camp Ashcan and Camp Dustbin. By 1950, Eichmann was preparing another vanishing trick. Guided through rugged terrain, he hid in cabins, spent tense nights in hotels, and eventually he was supplied with a fake ID and taken to a safe house in northern Italy. His escape plan involved powerful allies in the Vatican and Argentina. His new name? Ricardo Clement. Buenos Aires was fertile ground for Nazis. Under President Juan Perón, who had called the Nuremberg trials an outrage that history will never forgive, Argentina welcomed fascists, especially Nazis deemed useful to the economy. Perón's anti-Semitic views mirrored Nazi propaganda, once saying that Jews lodge like cysts in the people where they establish themselves. It was the ideal place for Eichmann. In Genoa, the International Red Cross approved Mr. Clement as a refugee. On June 1, 1950, he received his passport with a photo and fingerprints. Getting a visa from the Argentine consulate was easy. Soon he was drinking Chianti and playing chess and looking forward to the future. A few weeks later, he was standing on the deck of a ship, a third-class ticket in his pocket. With him was another SS officer from Hitler's bunker and a Hitler Youth commander. As Europe faded behind them, he thought about his family. A month later, he stepped onto Argentine soil with no intention of ever going back to Europe. He arrived with 485 persons, no work papers, and in a city with sprawling slums. Certainly not the kind of place for a man used to having servants and vacation homes. But the Nazi network soon found him a job in a metal shop. Later, with residency secured, he became an engineer. At 2,500 pesos a month, life was comfortable. In 1952, his family joined him. It had been 7 years since he had seen them. He hugged Vera and told his sons, "I'm your Uncle Ricardo." They had been raised to believe that he was dead. But the eldest, Klaus, was not fooled. Behind closed doors, Vera was happy but also furious, waving thick newspaper clippings that detailed her husband's crimes, the deaths in their millions, women and children. He denied everything, insisting he was just a bureaucrat. She never brought it up again. Back in Europe, Wiesenthal was enraged. The Eichmann home now stood empty. Vera and the boys disappeared. Teachers told the Nazi hunters that the children simply stopped showing up. Rumors swirled. South America, the Middle East, even Germany. But with no proof, Wiesenthal was tormented. He couldn't sleep. He wouldn't rest until the Eichmanns were in his grasp. In Argentina, Eichmann stayed cautious. He never publicly acknowledged his children. When another son was born, he named him Riccardo Francisco, after the priest who helped him escape Italy. But this one on paper was his only son. For years, he kept his head down, knowing his name still surfaced in newspapers as one of the world's most wanted men. Then, as so often happens in life, karma came knocking on Eichmann's back door. Lothar Hermann, a half-blind German-Jewish immigrant in Argentina who had survived the Dachau concentration camp, read an article about Eichmann in the newspaper. He thought of his daughter, Sylvia. He had never told her what had happened to him in the war because he had hidden his Jewish identity when he had fled to Argentina. He now knew that he had to come clean for many reasons, but one being that Sylvia had once dated a young man named Nick Eichmann. Sylvia said Nick's father was dead, but during the war he had ties to the Nazis and openly held anti-Jewish views. Lothar put two and two together. Could Sylvia's ex-boyfriend really be the son of Adolf Eichmann? Sylvia told him Nick had never revealed much, not even where he lived. He was secretive, evasive, and that just made Lothar more suspicious. Unfortunately, she hadn't seen Nick for ages after moving house, so they had no idea where he was. This was too strange to ignore. Lothar first contacted the German embassy, but it was still full of officials who mourned Hitler. Instead, he wrote directly to Fritz Bauer, chief prosecutor of Hesse. He told them that he was certain Eichmann, living under the name Clement, was in Buenos Aires with his family. Soon a photograph arrived by post. Sylvia studied it. Yes, she said, that is him. She began her own investigation. After some digging, she found the house and went to visit, claiming she wanted to see Nick. Nick wasn't at home, but a man in his 50s or 60s invited her in. Sylvia's mind raced. Sitting in slippers across from her could be one of the architects of the Holocaust. Then Vera appeared, demanding to know who had given Sylvia the address. The standoff broke only when Nick walked in. Uneasy, he said little. The older man told Sylvia she was welcome back any time. "Thank you, Father," Nick replied, and offered to walk her to the bus stop. On the way, Sylvia asked, "Why did you just call your uncle Father?" Nick stalled for a second and then muttered something about it being a sign of respect in Germany, and she boarded the bus trembling. As it pulled away, relief washed over her. She told her father back home, "It's him, Adolf Eichmann. I'm sure of it." In March 1958, Kurt Weiss of West German intelligence met a CIA officer in Munich to share Nazi-related intelligence. Both sides had Nazi assets, something they couldn't admit publicly. In truth, many of these assets were unreliable, their loyalty questionable, and their morality dubious. Now they talked about Adolf Eichmann and the news that he might have been spotted in Argentina. His name was misspelled Clemens in the reports. They couldn't be sure it was Eichmann, but they would still be criticized later for choosing not to alert Nazi hunters or Mossad. The US, under pressure to investigate, had ignored Weisenthal's pleas. It didn't serve American interests, and too many of their operations were entangled with ex-Nazis. And no one at the time wanted that to get out. Meanwhile, in Argentina, Eichmann grew isolated. He would rant about the war and claim the Reich had been betrayed. He drank too much, he smoked too much, and he often fell into despair. In his diary, he once confessed, "I am growing tired of living the life of an anonymous wanderer between two worlds." He insisted that he was neither a murderer nor a mass murderer, though he admitted complicity through deportation orders. By 1960, Mossad launched Operation Finale after a tip from prosecutor Fritz Bauer. Bauer distrusted West German intelligence, still riddled with former Nazis, and so he turned to the Israelis to hunt Eichmann instead. But Mossad needed absolute proof before its agents could act. Their plan, essentially kidnapping Eichmann, was illegal under international law. If they were caught in the act, the agents could be arrested in an international scandal. Scandal was fine, but not if they failed. So they slowly began surveillance. They staked out the house, 4261 Chacabuco. But Sylvia hadn't been there in 2 years. It was now empty. Eichmann had actually left only a few weeks earlier. Then came a break. A local boy told them one of Eichmann's sons worked at a nearby garage as a mechanic. After surveillance, the agent sent back a coded message. "The driver is red," meaning that they likely had found Eichmann. But HQ wanted only one message: "The driver is black, definitely Eichmann." Watching the garage, they spotted a man in his late 50s on a moped picking up his son. They tailed him through a series of turns only to lose him behind a funeral procession. Still, with persistence, they located his new home on Garibaldi Street. Using a hidden camera inside a briefcase, they tried to capture photos of anyone entering or leaving. Someone suggested buying the cottage next door for better surveillance. Mossad HQ denied the request. Eichmann sensed the hunt was closing in. He had grown more cautious, easier now that his sons were grown up. The eldest had his own place, Another was a merchant marine, the third a mechanic. Soon all would be out of the house, and the youngest knew nothing of his father's past. Eichmann had grown more suspicious. He had noticed strange men in the neighborhood, so more than ever he kept his head down. But one day, as he hung out the washing, they got a clear view. That night, the message went out. The driver is black. The mission was dangerous. Argentina was full of Nazi sympathizers, and in government circles, anti-Israel sentiment had lingered after Perón's fall. The agents had no local support, no official cover, and there was Eichmann himself, nearly 60 but trained in surveillance and firearms. He might also have allies. They had to be careful. One wrong move and they could be dead or in prison, or Eichmann would be up and running. Once captured, he would have to vanish immediately, hidden away until he could be flown to Israel. But there was a problem. They couldn't use a military plane. How do you smuggle a man onto a civilian flight without anyone noticing? Even for a seasoned intelligence agency, it was a near impossible task. But first, they needed that one clear photo. On Sunday, March 20th, 1960, an agent lay under a tarpaulin in the back of a Ford truck, peering through a hole with binoculars. Others waited nearby. They watched Eichmann leave home in brown pants, an overcoat, shirt, and green tie. He spoke briefly with his gardener, but they missed the shot and had to get it later. Confirmation from Israel was fast, 100% Adolf Eichmann. More Mossad agents began arriving in Argentina under false identities. An Israeli delegation was already scheduled to attend Argentina's independence celebrations, which was perfect cover. The plan was to smuggle Eichmann out on an El Al plane when those delegates were heading home. Still, they had their doubts about getting an adult human against his will onto a passenger plane. Every day, Eichmann still rode the green and yellow 203 bus home from his job at the Mercedes-Benz factory in San Fernando. At 7:40 p.m., he would step off near his house, usually with a woman who walked the other way. Sometimes he stopped at the kiosk, sometimes not. With his house just a few minutes' walk away, they had only a short time to grab him. Each night, they kept watch, noting every detail, making sure his routine never changed. They often asked themselves, how could a man responsible for millions of deaths now live in such squalor? There was no running water, no electricity, just a shabby house and a drab neighborhood. To them, it felt like an insult to the dead. Sometimes the agents wondered if they had the right man. Only when Eichmann was in their hands could they be 100% certain. They mapped the route they'd take him on after they'd abducted him. The problem was all the places they'd have to stop for streetcars, potential trouble points. Still, they agreed. May 10th, we take him. It was all set up. Until they got word the El Al flight wouldn't leave Argentina until May 19th. Not what they wanted. They decided it was better to keep Eichmann in the safe house longer than postpone the abduction. Weeks of planning had gone into May 10th. Any delay risked raising suspicion. They had hired cars. They had 10 apartments ready as backup safe houses. Each day, Eichmann got off the bus at the expected time. But surveillance was becoming riskier. Locals had noticed them. Once, a policeman stopped them from making an illegal turn. With the day approaching, they rehearsed the abduction, uncertain if Eichmann would fight back. Two of the toughest men were chosen, men who knew how to kill and wouldn't hesitate if it came to that. On May 10th, a black sedan pulled up as Eichmann walked toward his house. The driver asked in Spanish the way to Buenos Aires. Eichmann found it odd. Why would a car with local plates need directions? The agents watched on and postponed for one more day. Back inside, Eichmann told his wife about the car. His suspicion was growing. He smoked more than usual and he didn't play his violin that night. Vera sensed his unease and she too felt a dark presence around their house. That night, she dreamed of him in a clean white shirt that suddenly turned red. The car had been nothing, but Eichmann's sixth sense flashing was valid. The next day, Eichmann shaved, washed with water from a bucket, and dressed. Before leaving, Vera told him about her dream. Be careful, she warned. He dismissed it and left for his long commute, riding the 203 and changing buses twice on the 2-hour, 20-mile trip. That day at work was routine until a rare union meeting kept him late past his usual 6:15 finish. Back at the bus stop, the team of 4 waited in 2 cars, eyes on the road. They were about to make history. Night vision binoculars scanned the street. At one point, a teenage boy stopped at the broken-down car and offered to help. "Do you need anything?" he asked. They willed him to leave, and luckily he rode away. At 7:40, the bus was late. Minutes passed. Then, a bus came but drove right past them. Then another. Their nerves frayed. Had Eichmann disappeared? Had they been exposed? His life ran like clockwork. What could have happened? 8 o'clock struck, the cutoff time. Still, they stayed. At 8:05, another bus appeared. This time it was Eichmann. He stepped off, flashlight in hand, walking to Garibaldi Street, his right hand suspiciously buried in his pocket. A gun? A storm gathered, thunder cracking in the distance. They could hear his footsteps as he got closer. At 45 feet away, his hand was still hidden in his pocket. "Be careful," one of the men said. At 5 yards, one of the men stepped forward. "Un momentito, señor." Eichmann froze, fear in his eyes. He glanced down toward the field, weighing up escape. Then they struck him, diving on him, forcing his hand downward, dragging him to the ground. He let out a scream, but the waiting car engine roared to cover the sound. They shoved him into the back seat, a hand over his mouth, and covered his eyes with a pair of motorcycle goggles they'd had blacked out. It all felt like an hour, but it had taken 25 seconds. They checked him for weapons, covered him with a blanket, tying his hands and feet and telling him, "If you resist, we will shoot you. Do you understand?" Silence. "Do you understand?" Again, nothing. He said nothing again when spoken to in Spanish. The thought crossed the men's minds that they might have the wrong man, but then in perfect German, Eichmann said in a calm voice, "I am already resigned to my fate." He probably thought that he was going to die, but hurting him was the last thing they wanted to do. At least they knew it was him. Eichmann didn't struggle on the way to the safe house. At one railway crossing, they sat for 10 long minutes, cars all around them, guys outside smoking, music blasting. Again, the warning, "Move and you die." At 8:55, they arrived. He looked pitiful in his grubby clothes as they searched for cyanide. Even his false teeth were checked. At first, he thought it was a robbery, but when the men spoke German, he knew that he had been captured by Jews. The scars confirmed it was him, including the one where his SS tattoo had once been. Still, he insisted he was Ricardo Clement, formerly Otto Henninger. But when pressed, he gave his real SS number, 889895. The slip gave him away. Asked his birth name, he said it, Adolf Eichmann. The relief in the room was so great that they even agreed to his request for wine to calm his nerves. Mr. Eichmann could drink, and he sure could smoke. "I know Hebrew," he once told them before trying to speak it. It felt like an insult. Some had to leave the room rather than strike him in the face. At home, Vera panicked. She told herself he must have had an accident, or that the things the newspapers claimed couldn't be true. She was already planning a search party. She would never see him again. Eichmann proved obedient, though he kept asking if they were going to kill him. He would later tell them that he was only a small cog in a vast machine. They knew better. He hadn't pulled the trigger, but his brains had killed generations, people they knew, family members. Still, they fed him, washed him, dressed him, and took him to the toilet. Killing him would have been easier. Instead, they now faced the impossible task of smuggling him out on a civilian plane. At one point, he said, "In a way, I love Jews. I wanted them to have their own country, but no nation would accept them." The extermination order, he insisted, had come directly from Hitler. It sickened them, but every night they let him talk, feeding him wine, coaxing out his words, already building a case. It was strange. They hated what he had done, but it was hard to hate the pathetic man in front of them. They had hoped Joseph Mengele, also in Argentina, might join him on the flight, but the trail went cold. The prize catch couldn't be risked, so they made do with Eichmann rather than expose themselves. On May 20th, Eichmann promised to go quietly into the flight. No sedatives needed, he told the doctor the men had enlisted. The doctor injected him anyway, telling him it was to calm his nerves. Drowsy, Eichmann muttered, "You can rely on me." If nothing else, Eichmann had always been dependable, unfortunately also to cold-hearted killers. By the time they brought him to the airport, his legs had given way. They carried him up the steps, all dressed in El Al uniforms, surrounding him. A blanket covered him up in his seat. Crew members glanced over, thinking perhaps the man was simply unwell. The engines roared. Eichmann was oblivious, now with a mask over his eyes. Relief swept the agents as the plane began to taxi, only to vanish when it abruptly stopped. A problem with the flight plan. Then at 12:05 a.m., the wheels left the runway. Safe in the sky, the men gathered the crew and told them, "You are taking part in an operation of supreme importance to the Jewish people. The man with us on this plane is Adolf Eichmann." They looked over at the helpless man in his seat, now nervously drawing on yet another cigarette. Word spread quickly, and the head mechanic erupted. His brother had been murdered by the Nazis, and he himself had survived the camps. He screamed at the agents, "You give him cigarettes? He gave us gas." The trial of Adolf Eichmann became a landmark of the 20th century. His abduction caused an international outcry. But it was not the kidnapping that shocked the world the most. It was Eichmann's ordinariness, his bland face, his soft-spoken reserve, the sheer absence of any menace. He did not look like a monster. He looked like a regular dad, like a friendly neighbor who always throws the ball to his kids. Hannah Arendt, covering the trial, would call it the banality of evil. Eichmann tried to defend himself by insisting, "I was only following orders," a line that echoed through the courtroom and the world press. The judges didn't accept it. Eichmann was found guilty on all counts, crimes against humanity and war crimes, and sentenced to death. During the night of May 31, 1962, in Ramla prison, Adolf Eichmann was hanged, the only civil execution ever carried out in Israel. When the guards moved to cover his head, he refused. Witnesses said he seemed almost elated, as though he had forgotten he was at his own funeral, as if his mind had tricked him once more into believing that he had done no wrong. His last words were defiant. "Gentlemen, we shall all meet again. Long live Germany, long live Austria, long live Argentina. I had to obey the rules of war and my flag. I am ready." His body was cremated, his ashes scattered at sea, beyond Israeli waters. No place on earth would ever serve as a shrine to the man who had built the machinery of the Holocaust. Catching the Holocaust's architect is one thing, but the way his plans were carried out was even darker. Watch how Nazi gas chambers actually worked to see the grim truth, or click on this video instead.